Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Allison Jones, and on behalf of Canadian Nuclear Laboratories and our supporting partners, Atomic Energy of Canada Limited, Health Canada, and the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, I'd like to thank you for tuning in with us today. CNL's Low Dose Research Webinar Series is an opportunity for us to help strengthen connection within the research community with a focus on lectures delivered by world-leading researchers pertaining to the effects of low-dose radiation from different sources. Today, we're really pleased to welcome Dominique Laurier. Before I hand it over to CNL's Marie-Claude Gregoire to introduce Dr. Laurier, I'd like to share that this webinar is being recorded and a link will be shared for viewing. I would also encourage you to use the Q&A function at the top of your screen. Throughout the presentation, we encourage you to write in any questions you may have for Dr. Laurier, and we do our best at the end of the presentation to have Dr. Laurier address those questions. Marie-Claude, now over to you.
Thank you, Alison, and I would like to say a warm welcome to Dominique and bienvenue, because this is a bilingual country, but I'm going to speak English here for all the audience. Yes, you will be presenting today the epidemiological studies of low-dose risks over the past decade, overview of lessons learned and challenges ahead. So I'm going to speak a little bit through your bio. And so you hold a PhD degree in biomathematics from the University of Paris in France. You're the deputy head of the health division at the French Institute for Radiological Protection and Nuclear Safety, IRSN. You also have 25 years of experience in radiation epidemiology, and especially the assessment of long-term health risks associated with exposure to low-dose and low-dose rate ionizing radiation. Next slide, please. And you have also participated to many international collaborative research projects. You have authored and co-authored more than 190 articles in peer-reviewed scientific journals. And you also participated to several national and international expert groups, the WHO, and the International Agency for Research on Cancer. Currently, you're the member of the main commission and the chair of the Committee 1 of the International Commission on Radiological Protection, ICRP. You also an alternate representative of the French delegation to the UNSCEAR, United Nations Scientific Committee on the effects of atomic radiation. And you're also chairing the Nuclear Energy Agency high-level group on low-dose radiation, on low-dose research. And with that, in perspective, I will hand over to you, Dominique, to deliver your talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie-Claude, for this very kind introduction. And so I'm going to share my screen. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. And so, yes, as you said, what I propose for this talk is to give an overview of the epidemiological results at low dose risk over the past decade or decades, and to discuss about what we know today, the lessons learned, and also what are the challenges ahead. So for the presentation, I propose to have an organization in four parts. What do we need about when we speak about radiation epidemiology, results on cancer risk and non-cancer disease very shortly, and we will end up with conclusions and perspectives. So epidemiology is not the only discipline to analyze the effects of ionizing radiation, of course. And there are many results coming from radiobiology, radiotoxicology at different levels, molecules, cell, tissue, organisms. But epidemiology will be the discipline to look at the effect in a global population. And the results are clearly have to be considered as clearly complementary with the results coming from radiobiology. Classically, we consider two types of effects associated to exposure to ionizing radiation, what we call deterministic effects and tissue reactions. These effects are considered to occur only at high doses, above a dose threshold, and the seriousness is increasing with the dose above this threshold. It's specific effects of ionizing radiation, and it's the treatment of these effects is considered to be at the individual level. So the medical care for specific individuals. What we are interested in today for the talk is what we call stochastic effects. Stochastic effects, the expression of these effects is not in the seriousness associated to exposure to radiation, but the frequency will depend on the level of exposure. And so the observation of a stochastic effect will be that between a non-exposed group and an exposed group, the frequency of the stochastic effect will be different and will be increased with exposure to radiation. For this kind of effect, we consider there is no threshold, and that even low doses can lead to an increase in the frequency of the threshold, in the frequency of the disease. Sorry, and to look at that, we cannot look only at the level of the individuals, but we have to look at the level of the population to analyze the frequency in a group of population, and the tool to analyze the discipline to analyze such effect is epidemiology. So if you open a book and you look at the definition of epidemiology, you will find something like that. Epidemiology is the study of the frequency and distribution of health effects in time and space among humans, and of the factors determining the variation of this distribution and the frequency. So this is observation science. Epidemiological studies are going to look at the frequency in a given population, and to try to have information about the levels of exposure, to try to have information about the occurrence of the disease, and from that to work on the relationship between exposure and effect. The advantage is that it considers directly the relevant effect for what is stochastic effects. And the other advantage is that epidemiology encompasses all biological processes that are underlying the mechanisms for the occurrence, for the development of the disease in a group of population, which are of relevance for stochastic health effects. So we can consider that there are two objectives in epidemiology. The first one is descriptive, and the second one is analytic, and that's the one we are going to be interested in radiation epidemiology, to identify the risk factors and to quantify the relative risk, so the increase in the frequency of the effect in a given group of population, and to try the modeling, to work on the modeling of the relationship between exposure and risk. So the objectives of epidemiology in the field of ionizing radiation is that to identify the effects induced by radiation. We know we have a lot of information already on the stochastic effects on cancer, but also we are interested today in non-cancer diseases, to characterize the time sequence between the exposure and the effect, to quantify the dose-risk relationship, and when this dose-risk relationship is identified, to determine what are the modifying factors of the relationship, like a variation of risk with age and sex, for example. I'm going to speak about low doses, and I'm going to use the definition of low doses given by the NSCARE. In my talk, low doses will be when we are dealing with doses of less than 100 milligram, whatever the pattern of exposure, either acute or protected over time. We're going to deal with levels of dose that are in the range of tens to hundreds of milligrams. So if we look at the history of epidemiological studies of ionizing radiation, that's a very rough summary. It began in 1950s, like modern epidemiology, and the first populations that were considered were what we call historical studies like radiologists, radium dial painters, medical exposure for causes outside of cancer. And these studies were very high levels of doses. They were able to show that there was an increase in the frequency of stochastic effects, but the level of exposure was not quantified precisely enough at the individual level to quantify a dose-risk relationship. And the major study in the field of ionizing radiation of low doses is the study of the A-bomb survivors, the Japanese A-bomb survivors. The denomination is the lifespan study. Sorry, and I'm going to come back in more details to the LSS. After that, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and so on, we can see that there are many different populations that have been considered in epidemiological studies, like miners, population exposed to fallout from atmospheric nuclear weapons, nuclear workers, and population exposed to natural background radiation, including radon, and the consequences of the Chernobyl accident, and more recently, the consequences of the Fukushima accident. So we can consider that the studies are considering many different populations, many different situations of exposure, and I'm not going to go into a review of all these different studies, but I will try, if I have some time enough, to discuss about to present results from several of these different populations. So with that introduction, I would like to come to cancer risk. So I'm going to begin with a presentation of some results from the major study, again, in the field, the study of the A-bomb survivors, the Japanese A-bomb survivors. So that's a cohort including 120,000 individuals that were alive 5 years after the atomic bombings in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. A large part of them have had reconstructed doses, 86,000 individuals with reconstructed doses. Exposure was essentially external radiation, mainly gamma and component of neutron, and it was at very high dose rate. We often consider this study as high doses because some of the individuals received several grays, but 80% of the population received doses that were lower than 100 milligrams. So a large part of this cohort is clearly corresponding to analysis of the risk in the low dose range. One advantage of this population is that it includes both sexes, all ages, and the mortality and incidence follow-up is still continuing today with more than 50, 60 years of follow-up now. And so this study clearly provided a lot of results about what do we know, what are the cancers that are induced by radiation, what are the estimates of the dose-risk relationship for these different cancer sites, what is the latency between exposure and increased risk, what is the variation of risk with age at exposure and attained age, and some results on non-cancer diseases also. So one first result from this cohort is what is presented here. This graph presents the relationship between the relative risk, the excess relative risk of solid cancer, so all cancers corresponding to different organs together, and the x-axis here is presenting the dose received by the population, and the y-axis is presenting the excess in the relative risk. The points for different categories of doses are presented by the points here, and the very vertical lines here are representing the confidence interval associated to that. So the larger the confidence interval, the larger the uncertainty associated to the estimate of the relative risk between a non-exposed population and the group of population that was exposed to a given level of exposure. And when we consider all these different points and we try to make to consider the relationship between the dose risk relationship, that's what is presented here. And so we can see that on the whole range of potential exposure from the LSS, we have a clear dose risk relationship, an increase in the frequency of solid cancer associated with doses. But if we are dealing with low doses, what we are interested in is finally the relationship in the low dose range. So in what is presented here at the left of the graph. This is a zoom on this low dose range, so between 0 to 500 milligray, and we can see that the different points here are still presenting the excess relative risk in different categories of dose. And we can see that finally, the linear model, which was presented on the graph just before, is fitting rather well the points, the observation in the different categories of doses. So from this study, we clearly have an evidence of a relationship between cancer risk and the dose. And very recent analysis of both mortality and incidence data is presented here, was published by Alina Brenner et al. In 2022. And so on the full cohort, with based on the very large number of solid cancer, incidence cancer, more than 22,000 incident cancers and 15,000 deaths from solid cancer. And what we can see is that in females and in males, we have a significant association, so a significant increase in the risk of cancer with dose. But we can see that there are some variation, either in the strength of the association and also in the shape of the dose risk relationship. The explanation for this difference in the shape of the dose risk relationship is still under analysis, but it seems that it's due to different distribution of the different cancer sites between men and women and between incidence and mortality. And one recommendation from that paper is that maybe to analyze the shape of the dose risk relationship, it should be done according to the composition of the different sites comprising all solid cancer group, and according to age at exposure and time since exposure, also with variation of the baseline rates with time. But clearly, all the data are showing an increase in the frequency of cancer, in the excess relative risk of cancer with dose, but with some differences between different groups that have still to be analyzed further. So one recommendation may be not to consider all solid cancers together, but to look at different cancer sites. That's what is presented in this graph here. The graph here, each of the points do not represent now the slope of the dose risk relationship for different cancer sites. And so an excess relative risk of 0 corresponds to an absence of increasing of the relative risk with dose. So something which that does not show any dose risk relationship. And we can see that for most of the cancer sites, the slope of the dose risk relationship so is clearly on the right side, so corresponding to a positive association between the risk of cancer and the dose to the organ. And we can see that for most of these cancer sites, the confidence interval here do not include the value 0. So we can say that it's corresponding to a significant association and positive association between the risk of cancer and the dose due to radiation exposure. For some of the cancer sites, the confidence interval includes the value 0, and so it's corresponding to a positive association, but not with not sufficient statistical power to say that it's corresponding to a significant association. Another results from the LSS, from the study of the A-bomb survivors, is presented here. Again, the graphs here, the different points correspond to the slope of the dose risk relationship. So the strength of the association between the dose and the risk here. And what we can see from this graph is there are two observations. The first one, if we consider 15 years after bombing here, we can see that the strength of the association is depending on the age at the time of exposure. And the strength of the association appears to be stronger if exposure was during childhood than if exposure was received during at adult age. The second observation that we can have from this graph is that there is a clear decrease of the risk with time since exposure or age at exposure. And so with time after the exposure, the association is still there, but the strength of the association is decreasing. Another very original and very interesting result has been published very recently, 2 years ago, for breast cancer. What we can see is that there is clearly an association between breast cancer and the dose received at the time due to the atomic bombings in Hiroshima and Nagasaki among females, and this association is still very, very, very significant 64 years after exposure. But what this article showed was that there was a marked reduction in excess relative risk and with attained age, and a modifying effect of associated with the age at menarche. So not only a variation of the risk with age at exposure, but a kind of specific window of time during puberty, during which it seems that there is a very specific sensitivity of the breast tissue with a higher dose risk relationship associated to exposure at the age of menarche. We change a little bit the view that we have about the variation of risk with age at exposure, and so not showing simply a decrease, a monotonic decrease of risk with age, increasing age at exposure. So, as a summary from the lifespan study, and again, that's clearly still the major study in the field of radiation of low dose radiation, and that's the major support for the consolidation for the construction of the system of radiological protection today. This study is still ongoing today, and still new results are produced by the study 70 years after bombing. It demonstrated radiation-induced risk for many specific cancer sites, for leukemia, for breast, for lung, for thyroid, for colon, showing differences in the strength of the association for different cancer sites. The risk of solid cancer and of leukemia appears to increase with dose for most of these cancer sites. The excess relative risk per unit dose decreases with age at exposure for leukemia and for most solid cancer, and possibly for specific windows of sensibility, like it has been shown for breast cancer among females. The latency, so the duration between the time of exposure and the time of observation of occurrence of excess risk of specific cancer sites in the population varies between a few years for leukemia to several decades for solid cancer, and more than 30 years for some of the cancer sites, and maybe more for some cancer sites like prostate, that has been shown to be associated with those in very recent publications. The dose-risk relationship for solid cancer is still significant after exclusion of highly exposed individuals. So even if you focus on the low dose range, you still have a significant association when you consider all solid cancers together. And at the time being, there is no element to support the existence of a dose threshold for cancer. So a value of dose below which we could say that we are sure that there is no increase in the frequency of cancer. And there is indication of variation of dose risk relationship between incidence and mortality, and with sex and with cancer types, and some association with non-cancer disease. I will come back to that point later on. So that's the basis, and that's the study, which is the major support for the construction of the radiation protection system at the time being. In the recent years, we have had results from pooled analysis that are very interesting in complement to the results of the LSS. A first example I would like to cite is InWorks. InWorks is a pooled analysis of workers from France, from the UK, and from the US. And so the total population is more than 300,000 workers, so a huge study with a very long duration of follow-up, approximately about 30 years, but with low doses. The mean cumulated whole body dose is about 25 millisieverts. That's the cumulated dose over the whole professional, occupational history of each of the workers. And the number of cancer sites, cancer deaths is very large also, so with more than 7,000 solid cancers observed in the cohort. And from that cohort, doing the same, so classifying the person years, the years of follow-up into different categories of dose, and looking at the relationship between the excess relative risk and the dose, we also obtain significant association between the risk of all cancers, so solid cancers, excluding leukemia, and the level of dose accumulated over time by this study, by these workers. And from the study, different modeling of the dose risk relationship was analyzed, with no indication of non-linearity between dose and risk. The authors tried also some analysis on restricted range. So that's what is presented here. On the full dose range, there is clearly a significant association, and the triangles, colored triangles, reflects very schematically the confidence interval, the uncertainty associated to these estimates. And the same analysis have been made, but restricting the doses to less than 200 millisieverts. And we can see that the confidence intervals still do not include the value 0, so it's still a significant association. The same if it was restricted to less than 150. And even when restricting to less than 100 milligray, the results were still showing a significant positive association at the limit of statistical significance. And so even when limiting the dose to low, the dose range to low doses, there was still a significant association between the protected exposure and the risk of cancer. If we want to translate these results in terms of dose risk relationship, in terms of what is the number of cases that we can attribute to the exposure to radiation exposure in this population, in a population of 1,000 workers with the same characteristics as the population included in the InWorks study, we are waiting for the same duration of follow-up. We are waiting for approximately 216 deaths. And among these 216 deaths, 64 will be by cancer or leukemia, not due to radiation, but just due to the baseline frequency of cancer in a human population. And in this population of 1,000 workers, according to the estimates that have been estimated in this cohort, approximately 1 will be attributable to exposure to ionizing radiation. Said otherwise, one case of cancer death would not be there if this population was not exposed to radiation. So that's the kind of interpretation of the magnitude of the impact of radiation on cancer risk. Other results have been published recently on thyroid cancer, a pooled analysis of 9 cohorts of children with a low dose radiation exposure, so limited to less than 200 milligray. And again, a very large population, more than 100,000 people with a long follow-up and showing a significant association even when excluding doses above 100 milligray, with no indication of departure from linearity. So again, a huge analysis of a pooled analysis of data showing a significant association. So for one specific cancer site, thyroid cancer. Another one on leukemia that has been published in the recent years. Again, a pooled analysis of the data from 9 cohorts in the low dose range, less than 100 millisieverts, a population of more than 260,000 children exposed with a follow-up of more than 20 years. And also a significant association, even after excluding doses above 100 millisieverts. So it's not that there is an observation of an association above 100 millisievert, but limiting the data and the analysis to doses below 100 millisievert, there is still a signal for an association between dose and risk. Another very recent publication, so published a few months ago, is from the EPICITY study. The EPICITY study is a cohort of 9 national cohorts with a huge number of children included, 1 million people exposed to CT scans, so for medical reasons, before the age of 22, with a very precise dose reconstruction and taking into account uncertainties. And the analysis of brain cancer has been analyzed in this population, so published in the Lancet Oncology a few weeks ago. A huge population, again, 658 children included in the analysis. The duration of follow-up is rather short, but the results are showing a significant association between brain cancer risk and doses due to the CT scans for doses below 100 milligray. So these results have to be considered very carefully, especially because there is a lot of uncertainties associated to that, and the mean duration of follow-up is rather short, 7 years only. But clearly, that's a new piece of information that has to be considered in the review of what do we know from radiation epidemiology in the low dose range. So based on these results from epidemiology, several syntheses have been published in the recent years. One has been published by the NCRP, looking at support or not of the different epidemiological studies for the linear-no-threshold model. And the conclusion, so they considered 29 studies applying systematically quality criteria, and their conclusion was that finally the results were supportive of a dose risk relationship even in the low dose range, and something coherent with the linear no threshold model. And the conclusion was that the LNT model was considered as prudent and practical for radiation protection purposes from this critical review. Another one was published in the frame of ICRP task group, looking at the results. They performed a combined analysis of the results from 22 studies, looking at population that were exposed to low dose rate, whatever so workers and environmental exposures mainly. And their conclusion was that the low dose rate data provided direct evidence regarding risk at low dose rates as an important complement to the LSS risk estimates for radiation protection. Another review that has been published in 2020 was published by the NCI Monograph, and they have been looking at the potential sources of bias in the studies in the low dose range. So confounding and selection bias, sources of dose error, lack of a statistical power, model misclassification, and from that they performed a very systematic analysis of the potential impact of bias in the studies in the low dose range. They considered 22 studies in the low dose range, and their conclusion was that most estimates of those risk relationship were free of a substantial bias, at least that bias were not susceptible to create to show an association where there is nothing. And the results directly supported the existence of excess risk associated with low doses for solid cancer and leukemia, and with a magnitude consistent with the estimates derived from the LSS. Another one was published in 2022, looking at synthesis of the literature in the low dose range. And again, the conclusion was that substantial evidence exists that ionizing radiation causes cancer for acute and protected doses above 100 milligray for sure, but with a growing evidence for even for doses below 100 milligray. And that results demonstrated that doses accumulated, so protected exposure accumulated over many years at low dose rates, do cause stochastic health effects. I'm going to skip the part on radon. Sorry. So that's a very rough review of synthesis and the pooled analysis that have been published on the risk of cancer in the recent years. Very quickly, the request was to discuss about challenges also. Another increasing observation in low dose epidemiological studies is about the risk for non-cancer diseases. First observation is that many studies today are showing an association between the frequency of cardiovascular disease and radiation exposure. So at the time being, cardiovascular disease is classified as a tissue reaction by the ICRP with a dose threshold at 0.5. A very large systematic review meta-analysis has been published a few weeks ago in the BMJ by Mark Little et al., considering 93 studies providing results on the quantification of an association between radiation exposure and cardiovascular disease. And the results are presented here. There is the relative risk increased with those for all cardiovascular disease and also for the 4 subtypes that were considered by the authors. And the relationship was still there when considering when the dose range was restricted to moderate doses below 0.5 gray. And the conclusions are presented here. So the results provide evidence supporting a causal association between radiation exposure and cardiovascular disease. But clearly there is a lot of uncertainties and heterogeneity in the results, and it requires further investigation. But there is a growing evidence of an association between the frequency of cardiovascular disease and radiation exposure, even in the range of several hundreds of milligray and below 0.5 gray. The second one is about the risk of cataracts and lens opacities, also classified as a tissue reaction by the ICRP with a threshold of 0.5. There have been several syntheses, and if we look at one very recent paper performing a review of epidemiological studies, 12 studies during the last 20 years, let's say, there is accumulative evidence of excess risk at lower dose and low dose rates, so lower dose than 0.5 gray from different epidemiological studies. So again, it has to be verified and it has to be considered very carefully. But some evidence that of stochastic expression in the risk of cataracts, even in below 0.5 gray. The last one and more recent is about the risk of neurocognitive diseases. And there have been two very recent meta-analyses published in the last 2 years, looking at a potential association between radiation exposure and the risk of neurocognitive diseases in different populations. So the first one considered 21 studies, the second one 18 studies, and both meta-analyses considered that, well, findings were supporting an association between low to moderate radiation exposure and the probability or the occurrence of the probability of occurrence of central nervous system diseases or Parkinson disease in the two different ones. Clearly, again, we have to be very cautious about the interpretation of the results. There are small numbers of studies, only 4, that are providing data for the analysis of Parkinson disease, and there is a large variation between the results from the different cohorts. But again, some increasing evidence of a potential association between neurocognitive diseases and radiation exposure, even in the range of low and moderate levels of exposure. So that's it, and so I would like to go now to some points of conclusions and perspectives. Clearly, in analyzing the results of low-dose epidemiology, we have to be careful. Low-dose studies are difficult to design, to conduct, and to interpret, and we have to be very careful in the interpretation of these results. All studies have limitations, even the most important ones, like the LSS, the workers, or the CT scan studies. There are bias associated to radiation to all epidemiological studies, but clearly it seems that from the monograph published by the NCI, that biases at low doses are not major and not susceptible to show an association, whereas if there is nothing. There are huge important uncertainties in the low dose range, but clearly these uncertainties can be quantified, and that's an evolution for the future. And the NSCARE report 2019 showed that it was possible to quantify and to consider all different sources of uncertainties in calculating the risk for a specific situation of exposure. And the results also show the interest of pool data. Many studies that, if they are considered by themselves, so separately, have not enough statistical power to show a small increase in the frequency associated to small levels of exposure to radiation. But pooled analysis and meta-analysis, so bringing together the data from different studies or the results of different studies, have the advantage to improve and to consolidate the interpretation that we can do from the results of epidemiology, providing a common design in the analysis, increasing the statistical power, and allowing to test for heterogeneity between the different studies that are combined in a pooled analysis. What are the results? If you have to as a take-home, if you have to keep only one slide, maybe that's this one. Clearly, during the last 2 decades, there is a clear improvement in knowledge from radiation epidemiology for cancer risk associated with low doses, compared to the 90s, where the system of radiological protection is based mainly on the LSS. But today we have many results coming from many different populations, from different countries, from different situations of exposure. And clearly the situation is much better today because we have a much wider range of results coming from different situations of population of exposure. So the situation is much more secure for the consolidation of the radiation protection system than the situation we had a few decades ago. There is some evidence from the results. We can say that there is some evidence of some effect risk of some cancers following low-level exposure to radiation. And there is some evidence of an increased risk of cancer with repeated or protected doses. So not only for acute exposure, but also associated to doses that are accumulated over time. Low doses are associated with low excess risk. That's also something that we have to that we have more and more clear evidence today. We should not speak about there is a risk or there is no risk. Clearly, we have to quantify the risk, and low doses are associated to a risk. We are more and more. There is more and more evidence about that, but low doses are associated to low excess risks. The epidemiological evidence for an overall material deviation from a linear no-threshold dose response at low doses and low dose rate is not persuasive. Said otherwise, there is no clear evidence today about the evidence of a threshold. There is no evidence from epidemiology about a value of dose below which we can be sure that there is no excess frequency of specific cancer sites. And no deviation really from it seems that a linear model seems to be adequate as a support for radiation protection system at least. And there is evidence for an association between lung cancer and exposure to radon. There are few results associated to internal exposure, but for radon we have some evidence for lung cancer. So if we want to present it graphically, we can present it like that. It is still considered, or it was considered a few decades ago, that we had epidemiological results at moderate or high doses, and but that in the low dose range the uncertainties were too large, and that so we were extrapolating using a linear model from observed risk to the low dose range. The reality today, in my view, is a little different. We have more and more data. We have a lot of data coming from many different epidemiological studies in the low dose range. And today, even considering only the low dose range, we have some evidence of an association between radiation dose and the risk for solid cancers and for several specific cancer sites. Of course, we have still lack of knowledge, so the list is huge. There are still very important uncertainties on what is precisely the shape of the dose-risk relationship at low dose and low dose rates. Of course, not all results are coherent. There are results that are diverging. Many studies are not showing any significant association, maybe just due to a lack of statistical power. Some results are showing a negative association, like the Kerala study in India, for example. But we have to, when we consider the global picture, so considering all results coming from all different epidemiological studies, clearly the evidence is coherent with a positive association between the cancer risk and radiation exposure, even in the low to moderate dose range. There are variations of radiation-induced risk between individuals, between population. Transfer of risk between different countries is still difficult. We have a lack of evidence for internal exposures outside of radon and radioactive iodine for thyroid cancer. The risk of long-term non-cancer diseases is really just increasing right now, and we have to be very careful in the interpretation of the results, and we are needing more and more information about that. About hereditary effects, also no study show an association in human population. The interaction between radiation and other factors, the discrepancy between epidemiology and radiobiology, this is different topics for which more research is needed in the next years. The routes of improvement, I said that already, to perform international pooled analysis, to try to control for potential bias as far as possible, to consider uncertainties, to perform multifactorial analysis, and to consider not only radiation but complex exposure situations, and to try to integrate biological and epidemiological approaches. There are different approaches that can be proposed for that, like the adverse outcome pathways, the development of the AOP approaches, or the application of biologically based modeling. As I said, so there are many studies ongoing. I'm not going to repeat it, but there are many studies that are promising new results in the recent years. The A-bomb survivors is still ongoing, of course. InWorks is still ongoing. PUMA on minors. The US million-person study, which published many different articles at the end of 22, and the pooling of the different data may provide very interesting results in the future. Opacity study, a new paper is awaited on hematopoietic cancers in the recent years, and many other different studies that still will bring some interesting results in the next years. All these results are clearly a very important support for radiological protection, for the shape of the dose-risk relationship, for the effects, the modifying effects of the dose-risk relationship, for the transfer of risk between different populations, for the estimates of risk for non-cancer effects. And all these different results have to be considered in the evolution and the revision of the basis, the scientific basis for the system of radiological protection. With this, I would like to finish with three actions that are ongoing at the international level. The first one is by the NEA. So the NEA implemented 3 years ago a high-level group on low-dose research with the aim to increase global networking and the better coordination of research in the low-dose range to support radiation protection policy, regulation, and application. And the 3 actions have been developed: the implementation of a global register with the aim to gather information about all research projects in the low dose range currently available, and the data the input of data can be done on the web tool, the development of the AOP approaches in the radiation field, and the improvement of the communication on the reality of the low dose risks. Another one is the NSCARE. The present program of work of the NSCARE has very important groups that are reviewing the literature corresponding to what I just presented. One major group is reviewing the epidemiological evidence for radiation and cancer, and this report is expected for 2025. And several groups that are ongoing or will begin in the next months or years on the circulatory disease, on the nervous system effects, on the effects on the eye, and all these different groups will provide very interesting synthesis of the scientific literature in the coming years. And the last one I would like to raise is the ICRP. So as you may know, the ICRP has launched a new process to revise the general recommendations. It's a long process, and the target is in about 1 decade. But different building blocks, different task groups have been elaborated to review the scientific analysis and to take into account this evolution in the scientific literature, in the construction, in the consolidation of the system of radiological protection. And if you are interested in this process, the next rendezvous will be in Tokyo in November 2023, and you're welcome to participate in the discussion about the potential evolution of the system of radiological protection in the next decade. And with this, I think I thank you very much, and I'm open for several questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Laurier. We do have some questions, and we have a bit of time, so I will ask some of these. So the first one is, can you talk to how to balance risk and importance in medical diagnostics?
No, yes, of course. Clearly, for medical applications of radiation, the risk has to be balanced with the advantages and the medical benefits of imaging for medical diagnosis is clearly far more important than the risk associated with radiation exposure. But for a good radiation protection, for a good use of radiation in the medical applications, it's important to have a good estimate of what is the risk associated with radiation exposure, even at low doses, and that's the role of the epidemiological studies that are performed at the time being. So, of course, for medical application, the risk has to be balanced with the benefits, and clearly the benefits of medical imaging is obvious.
Thank you. The next question, you presented data on the low dose range, 10 to 100 milligray. Do you think anything can be said about risks at below 10 milligray? And is there scope for using the radiobiology example using arguments of Brenner et al. PNAS 2003 to allow us to say more in this very low dose range?
I don't know how far we can go in the low dose range. Clearly, there will be limitations. It has been possible in the recent decades to go down to what we call low dose range, so several tens to several hundreds of milligray, and we can see that we still have the evidence of an association for several cancer sites in that range. Will it be possible to get down 10 milligray one day? Maybe for some of the cancer sites, but my personal view is that we have enough scientific evidence today to show that there is still a dose risk relationship in the low dose range, and after that, that's more a social decision of what do we think is acceptable or tolerable by the population, but and not to weight everything. The question of what could we accept as the risk associated to low doses, in my view, is more a social issue than a scientific one today. And in the second part of the question, yes, of course, I think that in the coming years, it will be very important to try to bring together information from epidemiology in the low dose range, but also from radiobiology, and to try to integrate some of the knowledge and mechanisms that are in the process between exposure and the occurrence of a cancer in the modeling of the dose risk relationship. There is some tries already, but clearly I think it should provide benefit in the quantification and in the understanding of the relationship between exposure and risk.
Thank you. The next question is a two-part as well. Are there studies to define treatability of the cancers more concretely linked to ionizing radiation? And are cancers caused by ionizing radiation belong to the group of easily treated cancers, likely untreatable cancers, or is there no correlation that can be seen?
That's a very good question. As far as I know, today it's not possible to say that this cancer has been caused by radiation and this not has been caused by something else. Many different teams are looking for a signature for cancers, and there are still research on that. So maybe one day we will have some possibilities according to the characteristics of the cancer to say, well, this one has a good probability to be caused by radiation and this one is caused by something else. But at the time being, what I consider is that we are not able to discriminate between cancer, which is radio-induced, and non-induced by or induced by something else than radiation. And what we can say from epidemiology is that in an exposed group, we have a larger frequency of cancer than in a non-exposed group. But we are not able to say who is going to have cancer in the next years, for example.
Great, thank you. We've reached our time, so I'm just going to pass it back over to Marie-Claude for a few final words.
Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you very much, Dominique. The overview was excellent, and I think a lot of people enjoyed it. We still have a couple of additional questions, but we are now, starting over time, being over time. So we're going to conclude this session, but we might send you those questions, and they are anonymous, so there might not be answers, but that's food for thoughts. You gave us a lot of food for thoughts as well. I think the whole audience. So thank you so much for that and your insights and that really very comprehensive overview. And so with that, we're going to close the session and we'll meet you again in June. Thank you very much.
Thank you again for the invitation. Yeah.